So today I'm going to take a look at a logical fallacy known as a Kafka trap. Now this is the original article where a guy, I think it's Eric Raymond, came up with this idea. So if we look at this, there's a bit of background to it in the first paragraph there, and then he goes on to describe it. So essentially it's the Kafka trap is where your refusal to acknowledge that you are guilty of a sin such as racism or sexism thereby confirms that you are guilty of that sin. And he says that he's been presented with so many instances of it that he's decided to give it a name, and he came up with a Kafka trap. There's also different versions of it. So he talks about the Model A Kafka trap there, but the further down the article it talks about other models. Now I'll put the URL to this as usual in the video description if you want to go and read this for yourself. So, and then the next paragraph we can see here that he says why he came up with this. So it's a reference to the novel The Trial by Franz Kafka, in which the protagonist Joseph K gets accused of crimes which he never really knows what they are, and the only way out of the trap for him is to acquiesce in his own destruction. So the logical fallacy, when you do come across it, it's really very much a bad faith. It's been sort of defined as a almost like an impregnable rhetorical fortress whereby any attempt to say that you're not guilty of that thing by definition actually makes you guilty. So essentially it's just a tautology. Now it obviously occurs in many different contexts, but I think a particularly interesting one, which has certainly been written about in many places on the internet, is this concept of white fragility by an American sociologist called Robin DiAngelo. So she tends to generalize quite a lot, and I think I saw somewhere that she justifies that because in sociology you do make generalizations. But we can see here in her description of it that it's essentially a Kafka trap. So she says that racial stress results from an interruption to what is racially familiar. In turn, whites are often at a loss for how to respond in constructive ways. And then she goes on to state then that white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, and that it triggers a range of defensive moves. And those moves could include emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviours such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress inducing situation. So for her, whatever a white person says in response to this, unless they literally just completely kowtow to her idea, is that it's an example of their white fragility. So if you raise any kind of argument about it, by definition, she thinks that that is your white fragility. But it is just a tautology. Now, I don't know whether this was a good faith concept that she came up with. I mean, the one thing we do know is that it's been very financially lucrative for her. So she's written several really well-selling books. I think this one particular, White Fragility, was a bestseller. In fact, it does say there, New York Times #1 bestseller. And she also apparently earns a lot of money from giving talks and doing workshops where she essentially tells white people about this issue and that they've got to kind of spend the rest of their lives trying to minimise racism. Now, it's certainly fine for an academic who has made their recent life out of this to get totally obsessed about it, but I'm not really sure that most people are going to be spending their lives obsessing over it like she does. But I think the problem is a Kafka trap. Whether or not the person who's using it is acting in good faith or doesn't realise the kind of ludicrousness of this rhetorical system. Sometimes the best solution to this is simply either just ignore it, or maybe it might sound childish, but maybe the best solution is just to say, yeah, whatever.